I've got way too much going on right now, so it's lucky my Land Rover Discovery is super reliable. Turns out the steering box is stuffed. Let me get these oily bits cleaned up and then I'll talk about how this spiraled out of control. So this is the famous, infamous, notorious, not very goodness Adwest steering box. This box was used in Land Rover products from the 80s through to 2016, I think. So early Range Rovers with power steering, Discovery 1, and Defenders right through. Discovery 2 used an almost identical but not interchangeable box. So there's a lot of these out there, and if you're a Land Rover owner, you are going to go through this journey at some point. What happens is you fail your warrant of fitness or your MOT, normally because this bottom seal is leaking. So you order the seal kit, pull the box out, tear it apart, and realize you're stuffed. Because your worm gear looks like this. No big deal, it's a Land Rover, parts are cheap. So you jump online to whatever your normal website is, search the part number, and quickly realize that none of the normal brands make parts for these steering boxes. So you turn to Land Rover, and in fact, luckily, right now, they do have stock of this worm gear for the small price of £1,282. And if you're like me, up here, once you add import fees, shipping, taxes, it would be a $3,500 part by the time it landed at my door. So, we're not doing that. So the next step in your logical thought process is to go out and find a second-hand one in good condition. There were, after all, millions of them made. But guess what? Millions of them look like this. You'd have to be very, very lucky to find a good worm gear out in the wild at this point in time. So, in sweaty desperation, you turn to eBay. And look, lots and lots of cheap steering boxes. Okay, first of all, most of these are intended for the US market, so they're for left-hand drive vehicles. There is a company based in the UK selling these boxes, but for me, that would mean shipping out of the UK instead of China, which would be much more expensive. Plus, these guys are charging twice as much for the boxes in the first place. And look, maybe their boxes are different from the ones on eBay. I have no idea. You can do your own research. Now, these eBay boxes are interesting. They look the same as the original Adwest boxes, but Mike from Britannica Restorations pulled one apart, and see this big piston thing? Yeah, it doesn't exist in these eBay boxes. Apparently, the casting is empty.
No, there's nothing in it. It's a sample.
It's not drilling it.
There's nothing in there.
There's nothing in it.
Now, that's not necessarily a problem. This is a Toyota Hilux steering box, and you can see it also doesn't have the big piston doofus cylinder thing hanging off the side either. So these cheap eBay boxes, I don't know exactly what design they're copying, but they're the internals from something else put in a casing that looks like the Adwest box. Not necessarily a problem. However, the fact that they feel the need to fake the internals doesn't give you the most confidence in quality. Let's put it that way. The fact is, if I could pick one of these up for a few $100 locally, throw it in, get through my warrant of fitness, and solve the bigger problem later, maybe that's not such a bad idea. But I'd be looking at between $1,500 and $2,000 by the time one of these got to me. So I never really considered going down this path. Which leads me back to this. There must be a way to fix this. So there's a bearing race here and here. Here's one of the bearings. Sits on there like that, and this one the same. And this bearing race, which is machined into the worm, gets chewed up. And same down this end. Although I think it's more common to find failure here, but it can be either or normally both. Now, people talk about regrinding these bearing races. Well, first of all, you can't really just grind this away because that would change the geometry of the whole part. Plus, I'm not sure how the hardening is done on this part, but apparently it's not very deep, so you don't really want to grind it all away. The second suggestion is that you could spray weld this somehow and then regrind it. It's just not feasible on this part. Well, I think I have a solution. Well, not me. I've found a company that can maybe do it for me. What we're going to do is repair the pitting by electroplating new metal into the low spots. You've actually seen me do a similar process before. I think I electroplated the handles for this drill press by passing current through a piece of swab soaked in electrolyte. Obviously, that was applying a thin film of metal over the surface, whereas this is building up thick deposits in deep pitting, so it's different in detail. And I don't specifically know how that's done. It's someone else's entire industry. The company I'm using is called Selective, based in the megatropolis, Matamata. And just so we're clear, I'm talking about this company and putting their information on screen for your information. There's no weird YouTube deal going on here or anything like that. Now, selective plating, as per the images on their website, you're going to see this used in factories, repairing big hydraulic shafts, stuff like that. I haven't personally seen it used in an automotive context before, but I can't see any reason why it shouldn't be, so I gave them a call. And I'm not suggesting you send stuff to New Zealand. I'm sure you can find someone offering this service in whatever part of the world you live in. Anyway, I sent them these photos, and they are confident that they can repair isolated pitting like this, no problem, in the context of something turning at the speed of a steering shaft. Now, this continuous gouge, Frank, the guy I spoke to, thought that if you were desperate, they could maybe repair this to the point that it was usable. And I'll share my thoughts on that near the end of the video. Now, as it turns out, I am not going to send this exact shaft away to be repaired anyway, because it has other damage. You can see there's a big dent in the worm itself. I've no idea how that happened. I guess somebody slid sideways into a big rock while they were off-roading, or who knows. And that same impact also left a dent in this wheel and destroyed the bearing inside, so I need a new sector shaft too. Big shout out to Andy, thank you very much. I had to shake the Land Rover parts tree pretty hard to find a decent worm gear, and ultimately it was Andy who got me one, so again, thank you very much. I know he had to go through at least a couple of boxes to find this one. And a sector shaft as well. Now the good news is that this worm gear that Andy sent me is pretty good. There's a patch of pitting here, and that's it on this end race. On the inside one there is a tiny patch starting just in here, which you probably can't see, and another small patch over here. So this shaft, I think, is an excellent candidate to be repaired. And there's a little bit of wear on this sector shaft that Andy sent me, where the oil seal runs. It's not too bad, probably could get away with it, but I'll get this repaired at the same time. Some pamphlets. Some pens. And hopefully some refurbished parts. Oh, looks pretty good. Okay, here's the one that counts. Well, there it is. Looks perfect to me. In fact, I can't even see where the repair is, so I've no idea if we're looking at the good part or the repaired part. Here's the other end. Can't see any evidence on the race itself of any kind of repair. So in addition to filling the pitting, both races have been completely coated in nickel. Nickel being very hard, so hopefully they don't break apart again in the future. So yeah, I don't have much else to say. It's fixed. Although he explained over the phone to me that they do have to sand the repairs in by hand, and given that I can't see where any of those repairs were, he did a pretty good job. But the point is that this bearing race has obviously lost some of its accuracy through that process. But anyway, just looking at this, I don't think we're going to have any issue at all. The sector shaft is perfect, as you would expect. This was all pitted and had cuts in it from the oil seal, and now it looks brand new. Here's the other old one for comparison. This one, to be fair, wasn't quite as bad as this one to start with, but in any case you can see the damage is completely gone. The invoice hasn't actually arrived yet, so I can't tell you the exact cost. He did tell me over the phone, but I've forgotten, okay? But I think each bearing race was $220 and the sector shaft was $180. Something like that. And that's purely based on the guy's time. So let's say $450-ish to repair this worm gear. If the repairs hold up over a long period of time, I think that's money well spent. No complaints. Obviously, if you get this done, the cost will be different. Different company, different repair, different people. But that gives you a ballpark idea. Okay. Here it is. The big lump that it is. I did take the time to expertly paint it. By that I mean one really thick coat of rattle can black. So thick it washed half of itself off. And then fell off the chair into the dirt. But that's okay. And neither is this some kind of tutorial video. I've never worked on one of these steering boxes before in my life. But we'll follow the instructions and hopefully it works. SDC 2847G. G for expensive. This is the OEM kit. No idea if it's significantly better or not than the aftermarket ones. This is what Mamaku 4x4 carries, so this is what I got. So this is the seal for our worm gear. This is the input from the steering wheel. Stop! I'm going to talk about this in more detail in a minute, but I would recommend that if you're rebuilding one of these boxes, test fit the big bits first without the oil seals. Circlip. And yes, I think there is a spacer missing from in here that should sit between the oil seal and the circlip, but there wasn't one when I pulled this apart, so I'm not putting one back in because I don't have one. Also, another slight tangent, sorry. There are two slightly different worm shafts out there with the same part number. This was never an official change as far as Land Rover was concerned, but Adwest started machining some of the shafts down to fit a different oil seal. The shaft at the top is more typical, that's what you're going to see in all of the Discoveries and Range Rovers. The shaft at the bottom is out of a later Defender, which, interestingly, was the shaft that came out of my Discovery. So, obviously, I don't have my original steering box. Anyway, Adwest started machining the shaft down so that it could use the same oil seal as a Discovery 2 box. That's what I've been told. And I don't know if that seal comes in the standard kit. I think not, but there were a couple left over. Otherwise, start by ordering a Discovery 2 seal. Apparently that should fit. Okay, next, the sector shaft seal. So this is the bottom hole. This was where it was leaking. So we have a thick rubber spacer thingy, then a very thin looking oil seal, and then a circlip. And I think this dust cover goes over the top. So obviously we'll be replacing the oil seal. And I wonder if this is in the kit too. Is that supposed to be that? Maybe. This presumably is a dust cover. Is that what we're doing? I'm not sure what this original thing even is. It's just a rubber spacer. Okay. I think this bright blue seal is the equivalent of this rubber spacer. Well, that's what we're doing. And now this thing, metal side down. I have one less piece again. With the lip side leading, fit the oil seal to the casing, followed by a plain fibre washer. Again, I seem to be missing a washer. Don't know why. If that causes some kind of problem, I'll fix it. But we're moving on for now. Okay, next job is to fit the worm. Oh, that's exciting. So first we have to put in this bearing cup or race and some shims. Now this race is a little damaged from that impact or whatever it was. I think Andy sent me another set. Let me go and get that. And I don't know which set is front and back. It doesn't matter, we've changed the shaft anyway. And I can't really show this, but that just plops in there. There's a shoulder down the bottom. But it needs to sit on shims. And here are the original shims. Let me cut those off. The manual says to reuse the shims that came with the case, so that's what we're going to do. I didn't know this at the time because I was following the manual in order, but these shims shift the center of tightness. So when you set up your backlash on the worm gear, if the tightest spot isn't in the center, lock to lock, adding or removing 10 thou worth of shims moves the tightest spot a quarter turn. So that's why I would leave the oil seals out for now, because otherwise, anytime you add or remove a shim, you've got to drag both the worm shaft and the sector shaft out through the oil seals. So I would just fit both of those first, without anything else, to make sure the tight spot is in the center. That's what I would do next time. This just sort of sits in there. It's not really a press fit. It's kind of a nothing. Okay, and now we can fit one of the bearings. This is just power steering fluid. It specifically says in the manual not to use grease because it doesn't dissolve in power steering fluid and can clog things up. Now we need to fit this worm, and we are supposed to use Seal Saver RO1015 to go over the splines, which of course I don't have. Anyway, in she goes. Okay, I think that's it. And now the other bearing. And the bearing race. Now we're supposed to set the preload on this with a special tool and a torque special tool and all of these sorts of things. I don't have any of that. I do have this convenient piece of metal that fits inside there. We'll tighten it a little bit. Okay, now what we're supposed to do here is put a special wheel on here, tie some string around it, and use a spring balance to check the resistance. Actually, I can feel a little notchiness in that. I'm going to pull this back out and make sure it's clean. Okay, that feels better. There must have been a piece of grit in one of the bearings or something like that. Anyway, as I was saying, we're supposed to measure the rolling resistance on this. So, what we're supposed to do is tighten the big adjustment nut up and then loosen it until the worm gear has a rolling resistance of 0.9 kilograms on a 2.5 inch wheel. Now, I didn't feel like making a 2.5 inch wheel, so I just adjusted the figures for a 19mm shaft, but ultimately you will see I did go back and use a larger wheel. That just helps overcome the initial stiction. I don't necessarily recommend doing it either way. Setting these boxes up is kind of annoying and vague. Now, how do the repaired bearing races feel? That is the big question. I'd say, okay. I don't think they feel perfectly smooth. They feel smooth-ish, but not like butter, if that makes sense. In hindsight, I wish I had installed the shaft without the oil seals, just to get a better understanding of how the repaired races feel. But I didn't think to do that until afterwards. Anyway, I'll summarize my thoughts on the repair at the end of the video. So now we should fit this lock nut, which holds this in adjustment, but because I forgot to clean this or paint it, we'll fit this after the paint dries. Next job, we need to replace this seal. I assume this is it. And this needs to go into hot water to soften up. Now we carefully remove this somehow. Then here's the rubber seal underneath, as promised. Okay. And as this looks about right. Okay, once we fit the Teflon, or nylon seal as the book calls it, we have to fit it into the bore. So I'll quickly pre-lube that. And hopefully this just slides on without breaking. Okay, it's on. Now immediately into the bore. Immediately into the bore. Okay, it doesn't like to go into the bore. Okay. There. And now we let it cool down. Okay, I'm going to say that's definitely been long enough, although that could be influenced by the fact that I'm standing here doing nothing. But anyway, let's pull this out. Very nice. And now, to assist with installation, we need to find a suitable bolt to thread into the end of the piston. Yeah, that's definitely how you want to do that. And getting the teeth in the right orientation to start with is helpful, because you can't really rotate the piston. The bolt just comes undone. Obviously, I just shoved it in the first time. That's why I'm telling you this now. And now, push it in until it is 2.5 inches deep. Straighten it up. Looks pretty good. There it is, you can see it down in there. So now it's time for the sector shaft. And I've installed special tool RO606604 onto the end of the splines, as per the instructions. And in fact, the instructions here are a little confusing. Let me show you. Align the center gear pitch on the rack with the center gear tooth on the sector shaft, and at the same time rotate the input shaft about a small arc to allow the sector roller to engage the worm. What are we, doctors? There's 3 teeth, and there's 3 teeth holes on the rack thing, and we'll probably have to jiggle this a little bit. Capiche? Okay. Oh, this thing is a lump. In it goes. Okay. I believe we have to do a twisty twist. Okay. Back out, back out. Yeah, she was getting a little bunched up. Okay, special seal saver, Mark II, engaged. Now we're just pushing it all the way through the oil seal. Oh, we're all the way through the oil seal. Okay. Well, that was a bit of a faff, although if I had to do it again right now, I think it would be pretty easy. So just quickly, the trick was this piston, which has the rack on it, I just had to angle the rack slightly this way, so it was a little open, if that makes sense, to receive the gears on the sector shaft. At first I was trying to do it with everything nicely lined up, and it was just catching the rack. You just have to be careful because it takes quite a lot of force to get through the seals, and you want to make sure that that's all you're doing instead of breaking something. And if you've got your rack teeth in the right position, you'll have full movement from one side of the worm to the other. This little thing is next. That just sits in there. This is where it goes, so just make sure that rack is all the way down, and then drop in this, and then this. Now we're supposed to wind this until it is all the way seated. I think that's all the way seated. Now back off half a turn. No, just shove it in for now. You're going to have to adjust this later. Half a turn. Same with the set screw. The service manual says to put it in now, but there's absolutely no reason to do that. We still have to do all of our preload adjustments. Here's the old piece of nylon, and that was still in there. I could have just stuck the grub screw back in. Would have been fine. But we've got a new one, so we may as well use it. Nope, the new screws are garbage. Try and use your old one and the original little piece of nylon if you can. Now, the next job in the book is to fit this cover. But instead, I want to deal with this because I'll enjoy my lunch a lot more knowing that we've dealt with this. So first of all, we need to replace the seal. Okay. And we probably don't want to twist this one around, I would imagine. Go in here. Okay. Probably a bit too far, but it'll sort itself out. Now, I've got to get this spring retainer in here. And the service manual says we can do it by hand. So I guess we're going to try and do it by hand. I really don't want to have to make a special tool to do this. So we'll see how it goes. In fact, while we're here, because I didn't show you the dismantling, there's this hole on the side here. And you position this ring, you can tap it around in a circle, so that the edge is just past one of the holes, and then you put a punch through here and punch the end of the ring out of the groove. It's not too bad. If you need to, you can push this down a little bit so this becomes loose. Anyway, we've got to get it back in. How are we going to do that? The instructions say to compress the ring by hand while striking it into the groove with a hammer. I somehow think this is not going to be easy. Because I can barely squish this by hand. What are you talking about, Land Rover? It took a couple of attempts to figure out the right combination of clamps, but it wasn't bad at all. You need normal vice grips to get in and hold the end of the ring. You can't use a G-clamp or anything like that because you'll need a relatively pointy clamp. And then something like welding style vice grips.
Got it!
Come on! Job done. Easy.
It's in.
Now I believe this just threads on. Yeah, we need to be a bit careful here because if we tighten this incorrectly, it's going to squash everything together and probably put a big dent in our worm. So I'm just making sure we still have plenty of backlash. Get this all the way down. And we're still loose, so that's good. Now we'll put these 4 screws in. Before we go any further, we should probably fit this. The paint's 50% dry, that's fine. I'll put some anti-seize on the thread. And of course there is a special tool for this. We'll just use the punch. Okay, that's probably pretty good. Don't think it's going to fall off. In total, there are 3 adjustments. 1. Setting the preload on the bearings with this end plug, which I've already done. 2. Setting the backlash on the worm gear, which you do with this threaded rod that moves the sector shaft up or down. And 3. Setting the drag on the rack, which you do with this plug. Now, I did 3D print a wheel, the correct size, to make all of this easier. Each adjustment only adds 1 kg worth of drag, so I'd recommend getting a spring balance that measures up to about 10 kilograms. But most important, the backlash has to be set with the worm gear exactly on center, so halfway between lock to lock. This is because, as you steer away from center, there is more and more backlash by design. So if you take all the backlash out half a turn off center, it's going to be far too tight in the straight ahead position. You could break something if you don't realize. Sorry to emphasize this, but the service manual doesn't really make that clear. And the other thing is, if you set this up and your tighter spot doesn't seem to be on center, that's where the shims come in. So you'd have to pull the whole box apart and add or remove shims. There is a dust seal that goes on here. I won't push it over the splines just yet. In fact, I'm going to tape up the splines again. As I was saying, this dust seal goes on here. But before that, I am going to pack this with dielectric grease because water seems to be the enemy of these shafts. And yes, I appreciate that this means that dust will stick, but dust seems to stick in here anyway. Now that may be a bad idea. I'm not in any way suggesting that you should do that, but I'm going to do it. All right, now the drop arm. Let's just turn this around. Here is the drop arm. Now, you'll note on the spline here that there is a double spline, or a missed spline, which matches the inside of this. So you can't put this on willy-nilly. There are, however, 4 of these around the shaft, so you can put it on 4 different ways. You'll note that there is a hole here, and there is a slot in the back of the drop arm. This one has been absolutely destroyed, but there is a slot here. And I believe that that slot lines up with this hole in the straight ahead position. Presumably in the factory they pinned this so that everything didn't wobble around when they were putting the steering wheel on and wheels and whatever. I am going to use anti-seize on the spline. I'm not sure that this really does much on a spline, but this spline is a bit of a bugger at the best of times, so anything that helps is helpful. The lock washer? Yeah, I know. Reusing that crusty old lock washer. I am truly a piece of human garbage. I do not have a socket that size. 33.3, what the hell size is that? 1 5/16, I guess? Great. This needs to be done to 130 foot-pound. I might see if I can get a socket when I go in to get more fluid. In any case, I'll torque this up on the vehicle. Actually, what I was meaning to say, let me just take this nut off quickly. Removing this drop arm is the most difficult part about pulling this all to pieces. You need to use a proper Pitman arm puller. You can try and use one of these, but one of these is probably going to bend in half like a twig before it pulls this off. Now, the standard size Pitman puller is too small. This gap is small, so you need to grind this so it's slightly larger. But this distance should be okay, just. You may have to do a little grinding in here. And there's absolutely zero chance you're prying it off with screwdrivers or crowbars or anything like that, okay? The actual proper tool that Land Rover would have used, or Adwest would have used, is this huge hydraulic puller that fits over here. So don't think for a second that a screwdriver is going to work. Okay, where were we? Just leave that on there. We'll tighten that in the vehicle. Obviously bend the lock washer in the vehicle as well. The last little piece that I am going to put on, I have some stuff left over. I think most of this, like this oil seal, no idea what that is. I think those are for different variations. This, I believe, is intended to go here. If you remember, I did seem to be missing a washer from in between the oil seals. So this may be it, but it doesn't fit in the hole anyway, so yeah, I don't know. But then there's this, and I believe this is intended to go over here as a dust seal. So we may as well use that. It seems to press onto the shaft, and I guess it turns with the shaft. And again, I'm going to put dielectric grease in behind the seal, because if you look at this shaft, and this is the one that came out of this box, you can see it's extremely scabby. So this will hopefully prevent that. Okay, well there it is. It's on there. No idea if it's supposed to be on there or not, but it is. And that's it. I'm not going to film putting this back in. It's just a big heavy lump held in with 4 bolts. Or 6 if you count these 2. All I would say is if you have a V8 like me, you need to remove these 2 oil lines that run from just behind the oil filter over to the oil cooler. They're in the way. In actual fact, me talking in hindsight here, I would suggest yes, disconnect them from the radiator end, but at the filter end, maybe just crack them loose so you can sort of twist them out of the way, because I had a nightmare of a time trying to get them back in above the oil filter. There's an O-ring in there that you have to fish out, and there's no room to get a hand in there or even a pick or anything. Nightmare. The other thing is, In order to remove or connect the shaft coming from the steering wheel, I had to loosen the whole steering box first. You can't just pull it off with nowhere to pull it to. Other than that, it's just a big heavy lump held in with 4 bolts. It's in, and you can see why you have to take it out through the bottom. You can see there's plenty of space down here. It's only these oil lines that are in the way, because you have to move the box to the side to get it out or in. Anyway, it is in now, so next I need to tighten the drop arm nut. I bought a 34mm socket, torqued to 130 foot-pounds. You're not getting 130 out of an adjustable wrench, so go and buy a socket if you're doing this job. And then bending over the lock washer. And fellas, a lock washer needs to be bent over the nut and the part it's locking against. I know that's obvious to all of you guys watching this because, let's face it, we're a smart bunch around here. But I would estimate that 75% of old lock washers I've encountered have been installed wrong, only bent one way, which does nothing. In fact, this exact lock washer was like that when I pulled it out. And the fluid I'm using is power steering fluid. Officially, this system should take automatic transmission fluid type G, which is a very old ATF specification. And I know most people stick Dexron 2 or 3 in, which is a slightly more modern ATF specification, but type G is a little thicker than the Dexrons. And I noticed that Land Rover specified Dexron in the transmission for this vehicle, while still specifying type G in the steering, so I guess they wanted type G for a reason. Anyway, 30 years have passed and surely we can do better than ATF from the 80s. So I'm using a modern power steering fluid. This one meets type G specs and is even a little thicker. It's nothing special, just basic power steering fluid. Now, you won't get much fluid in without the motor running. And of course, the battery was flat. Now there is a bleed screw on top of the steering box that you're supposed to undo to let air out of the system. This was a disaster! Oil everywhere. I'm jumping between the key and the bleed screw and trying to keep fluid topped up. Disaster. Anyway, I got it done. The fluid's a little foamy, but that's okay. It doesn't take long for a little bit of air to work its way out of the system. And that's it. Steering box fixed. So how does it drive? Like a Porsche! Fantastic! A well set up Adwest steering box inspires the kind of confidence only found in the most high end of vehicles. No, it's not broken anymore. What do you want me to say? As for the bearing race repair, the short answer is yes, job done. Now, I think I could feel slight roughness in the repaired races when I installed the worm gear, but by the time the sector shaft was adding drag, any slight roughness was overcome, and there's no way I can feel anything through the steering wheel. Will the fact that the balls and the bearing have to run over a slight high spot or low spot cause premature wear? Who knows? If they were spinning at 10,000 RPM, yes, I think it would be a problem, but at the speed of a steering wheel, I doubt it. The only way I'll know for sure is to put lots of miles on the steering box and then pull it apart and see how it looks. In any case, the box is fixed. It doesn't leak, so I will pass my warrant of fitness. Actually, I didn't, but you know, other reasons. And there isn't a bearing race breaking apart, filling the system with chunks of metal. So, as an in-service repair, perfect. Done. However, if I did this again, I would consider getting the races ground after they had been repaired. First of all, if you're going to get a really bad gouge like this repaired, I think you'll have to get it ground afterwards. And secondly, grinding will give you a perfectly smooth bearing race. Potentially, as long as you get it done by someone good, because bearing races are pretty precise pieces of machinery. Anyway, I'm very glad that I repaired an original worm gear and rebuilt an original box. 100% this is the way to go, I reckon. So with that, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.